Good afternoon to all. Bem-vindos. Welcome to the Colloquium on Democracy and Inequality in Brazil. My name is Marcelo Medeiros, and I am a researcher at the Brazil Lab at the Princeton Institute for International Regional Studies, which is hosting this event. Our conversation today is organized in partnership with the graduate program in social anthropology of the Museu Nacional in Rio. I also would like to thank our on-campus co-sponsors, the program in Latin American Studies, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and the Department of Anthropology. We have with us today two outstanding Brazilian scholars. Professor Marta Arretche is Professor of Political Science at the University of São Paulo and a researcher and former director at the Center for Metropolitan Studies. Professor Arretche was Vice Provost for Research at the University of São Paulo from 2016 to 2018, and the editor of the Brazilian Political Science Review. She co-authored Paths of Inequality in Brazil, a half-century of changes and inequality in governance in the metropolis. And on a personal note, this is by far one of the best books on long-term inequality in Brazil I have ever read. And Professor Federico Neiburg is a professor of anthropology at the Museu Nacional, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Professor Neiburg's research focuses on moral values and the social, technical, and legal devices marshaled during economic emergencies. Neiburg has recently co-authored The Real Economy, after the kind, The Cultural History of Money, and Haitian Ethnographic Conversations. It's a great pleasure to have you, Marta and Federico, participating in this online discussion. We look forward to hearing your insights and learning more from your scholarship and public engagement. Our format today is the following. Professor Marta Arretche will start with a presentation, then Professor Federico Neiburg will follow. After their talks, we'll open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. We're taking questions from the YouTube channel, so you please feel free to join the conversation. Our team will be collecting questions and comments from the chat, and we'll forward them to me. So feel absolutely free to raise your questions, make your comments. I would like to ask Professor Marta to begin her presentation. Please, Marta.
So first of all, thank you very much, Thomas and Marcelo, for this invitation. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm honored by the invitation. And I would also thank Professor Federico acceptance of making comments on this presentation. I'm very glad because it's the first time we meet in an academic event. So thanks a lot, both for the invitation and the cross-disciplinary design of this webinar. Let me see if I share my presentation. I will first discuss very briefly two interpretations about the relationship between democracy and inequality in Brazil. And next, I will describe what I understand as an inclusive process that the current democratic regime in Brazil has witnessed, particularly as a result of the enactment of the 1988 Federal Constitution, a process which I will call as a process of inclusion by layering. I will explain that in some minutes. And by that, I also understand that, I mean, by layering, it's a non-concept in the endogenous policy change literature. I also understand that, and I will argue on this direction, that the legacies of the previous arrangement that is the arrangement that prevailed before the 1988 Constitution was not changed. And this combination of inclusion by layering and the policy legacies of the previous regime explains some of the challenges we face today, nowadays. And at the end, I'll show some data on a sharp change in inequality reduction processes in Brazil that started in 2015. And I'll explore the contribution of a mechanism I call retrenchment by drift that explain, in my point of view, some of the increasing of inequality in Brazil from 2015 on. So the debate on the relationship between democracy and inequality reduction is a very hot debate in the social science literature. There are thousands of very good pieces of work on this debate. But I would say that regarding the specific case of in Brazil, there are two answers to these questions: whether democracy contributed or not to the reduction of inequality, and both are supported by solid empirical evidences. One argument, one interpretation says that democracy did not reduce inequality in Brazil because the levels of income concentration remained high and stable. The top 1%, the richest, obtained and still obtain an exceptionally large share of total income. And so as a result, neither democracy nor left-wing governments affected income inequality in Brazil under the current democratic regime. Another interpretation says, yes, democracy did reduce inequality in Brazil because income inequality fall consistently from the early 90s on. It had fallen at a faster rate than countries that are currently among the least unequal, like Sweden, Canada, the United Kingdom, at the moment when they started their inequality reduction path. The pace of income inequality reduction accelerated under the Workers' Party governments, as well unequal access to basic services like health and education has been reduced. So as a result, democracy and left-wing governments did reduce inequality in Brazil. As odd as it might sound, the fact is that I would argue that both stories are correct because they are exploring different dimensions of the debate on income inequality and inequality in a in a broader perspective. Interpretation one is focused on income concentration and explores the share of income the richest obtain, whereas interpretation two is focused on inclusion, inclusive processes, and is focused on the remaining 99%, particularly on the bottom half of the income distribution. So if you have questions about the first interpretation, please address them to Marcelo, because he is a main reference on this literature. And from now on, I'll concentrate on the evidences of the second story, because I understand that besides being true, as the interpretation one is as well, it allows us to better understand the kind of challenges we are facing currently in Brazil. So if we look at the long term, we could say that poor people concentration in Brazil, poverty, special concentration has sharply changed. These maps were framed, designed so as to put in darker tones the higher values of the phenomenon of interest. So we can see that in 1970, Brazil presented low inequality in the sense that poverty was widespread across the country. And from the 80s to 2000, there a big divide between the North and Northeast and the South emerged. And in 2010, we can see that income inequality or poverty concentration was lower because colors are lighter. This outcome was a result of a long period of inclusion that emerged after democracy. So if we look at the relative earning gains of people split into different quintiles, we can see that here we have, for those that are not familiar with this kind of graph, we see that the poorest, the 5% poorest earned around nearly 100% relative to the gains they earned in 1984, whereas the richest earned less. So if the graph has this profile, meaning that the bottom half have had relative earnings higher than the upper side of the graph, we can say that income inequality reduced. We can say the same about some services. Again, in 1970, Brazil was quite equal in terms of access to electric power because electricity was, sorry for that, electricity was quite absent all over the country. And that big divide emerged, and in 2010, electricity was available for most households in Brazil. The story of sewage collection was similar in the sense that there has been an incremental inclusion, but at a very different pace. The sewage collection is still a shame in Brazil, and it is the result of the funding limitation of the Brazilian developmental state. If we look at the education outcomes here in red, we have the municipalities where the performance of the systems of the education system is worst. And you can see that the red colors disappear in the map, and the dark blue is the better performance, and the space where good performance appears in the map is enlarged throughout the period, meaning that education outcomes have improved. Again, we can discuss this point afterwards. I'm just trying to demonstrate to you that there has been an incremental inclusion in Brazil. Again, the same regarding health. Inequality has diminished. I can come back to these maps afterwards if you want. But The idea here is to demonstrate that there has been indeed inclusion in Brazil in several policies, although at different paces, which did change the well-being of the poor in Brazil. However, this inclusive process occurred by layering. What we understand by layering in the literature of the endogenous change of policies, meaning that change that happen on an incremental way over time. The concept of layering states that a new layer of policies is added over the previous arrangement. So the change did not dismantle the previous arrangements, but add new layers of policies over the previous one. So there has been in Brazil, as I tried to show you, an incremental story of inclusion, both on services and income. This incremental inclusion was a result of paradigmatic change in social policies set up by the 1980 Constitution. So we have a case the literature calls of inclusive democratization. We can come back to this discussion afterwards. And as in other countries like Chile, Mexico, Colombia, this outcome is the result of a competition for the vote of the poor between most parties. But the 1980 Constitution did not change, did not reform policies that in the previous arrangement, I mean, the social policies we had before the 1980 Constitution, particularly those that were framed by Getúlio Vargas and the military regime, the new layer of legislation, Bolsa Família, benefício de prestação continuada, pensions attached to the minimum wage, health, education, and so on. This new layer were set over previous regressive policies. So regressive taxation did not change in the 1980 Constitution. Indeed, under democracy, taxation in Brazil became even more regressive. So indirect taxes that negatively affect the budgets of the poor enlarged their participation in the total revenue collection. Direct taxation became even more regressive in Brazil than it was in the military regime, and tax exemptions, subsidies, deductions increased. We already had them in the period, and they had indeed increased. The 1988 Federal Constitution did not touch either in the unequal dimensions of the pension system, and the democratic governments, particularly Lula's government, did approve the reforms that reduced some of the most unequal pension policies, but it will take a long time for them both to be effective in fiscal terms, but particularly in reducing income inequality. And the 1988 Federal Constitution did not touch either in the divide between the private and public provision in education and health systems. So it's false to say that it's not true to state that social policies in Brazil reduce or increase inequality. Indeed, some of them increase inequality and some of them reduce inequality as a result of this mechanism of inclusion by layering. What happened in Brazil, what's been happening in Brazil more recently? There was a sharp change in the distribution of income in Brazil. So if you look at the period going from 2012 to 2014, we had a curve of the income distribution that let's say shows that the poor were earning more than the rich in terms of relative gains. What this graph is showing is that in this period, the poorest earned around nearly 20%, had around 20% in relative gains, whereas the richest earned much less. So if the curve has this profile, it means that the poor had earned more than the rich. What happened when the crisis started? Everybody lost because relative values are negative. The poor lost a lot. The richest lost as well. And those in the middle of the distribution lost less. These individuals, these households, are those whose earnings are earmarked to the minimum wage. We can come back to this evidence afterwards. And what happened from 2014 up to 2019? The shape of the curve completely changed. There has been a reversal of the profile of the income distribution. The poorest, those that are in the bottom of the income distribution, lost nearly 30% of their earnings, whereas those at the upper side of the income distribution earn a little bit. That's why the authors of this important piece of research argue that we have had up to 2014 a pro-poor income distribution because the poor earned more. But since then, we had a pro-rich income distribution because the poorest lost a lot. Of course, we are in the middle, a never-ending economic crisis, and the causes of this profile of the distribution and of the losses of the poorest have to do with economic crisis, in the sense that unemployment increased a lot, average wages were reduced, but some of this part of this behavior of the income distribution profile has to do with social policies in Brazil. So what I'm trying to say is that the incremental inclusion of outsiders, those that are unemployed, that are poor, that not have benefits from the job market, faded away since then. So this graph shows the expenditures on policies in Brazil that make cash payments to the poor. This line refers to the social the pensions, both contributory and non-contributory ones, earmarked to the minimum wage. This line refers to the Bolsa Familia program, the program everybody believed that was untouchable, that was preserved. There was a long discussion in Brazil that there was no need to constitutionalize Bolsa Familia because it was untouchable. So if we control by the 2013 expenditures, Bolsa Familia decreased its expenditures during the crisis. Expenditures did not return to the level of expenditures we had before the crisis, as well as the insurance, the unemployment insurance program also had a sharp decline. The point here is what I'm trying to show you, that part of this behavior of the income distribution is explained by the fact that many people lost their employments, went to a poverty situation, but this was not compensation by policies that were created and meant to compensate situation of crisis. Why? So I call these actually, I and my co-authors in this very recent piece of work we just concluded. Brazil is social policies, particularly those that affect the poor, are suffering what we call retrenchment by drift. What does it mean, this concept of drift in the social and the social policy literature? It comes from the idea that the dismantling of social policies does not happen by means of a frontal assault, by a clear and open cut, but by disguised and hidden mechanisms. And this by drift, which may be active or passive, we describe a situation like that we are living in Brazil from 2015, that there has been a huge economic crisis in the job market as a result of a sharp decline of employment and wages. The poorest were the big losers, but pro-poor policies barely compensated the job market crisis. So how did this process happen? New risks emerged and the government did nothing or even cut previous outlays. So there was severe cuts on more vulnerable programs. And what are these programs? Those whose decision-making rules favor hidden strategies, those that the authority to decide over their entitlement rules are concentrated on the executive. So this concentration of authority favors hidden strategies, as happened with Bolsa Familia, but in other programs. And along with that, the federal government stepped back from its role of coordinating subnational governments around shared policy agendas, which is again during COVID-19, this turned out to be very visible, but it was a process that was happening in Brazil through hidden strategies. That's why we can come back to this point if you want in the discussion, but although BPC, the benefício de prestação continuada, which is a non-contributory pension addressed to the very poor, those that come from the informal market, although it was threatened or not, it did not happen because cuts did not happen because they are protected by, it is protected by constitutional amendments, the same as pensions attached to the minimum wage. That's why those that have their earnings earmarked to the one minimum wage did not lose as much as those that depended either on Bolsa Familia on unemployment insurance, because as authority in these programs are concentrated on the executive government, the government has room to do nothing. So although the situation, new risks emerged, and the situation is pretty much worse, the government simply does nothing or even has room to cut outlays. So I would say that we, just to finish, I'm sure I'm running out of my time. Just to finish, I would say that the inclusion process we truly had in Brazil as a result of democracy clearly fade away, and the poorest are the big losers under the current economic crisis up to 2019, because under COVID the situation was a bit different, but the retrenchment by active drift turned out to be the dominant strategy by governments since then. That's it. Thanks a lot for your patience.
No, thank you very much. Actually, it was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I would like to invite Federico Neiburg to make the comments. Could you, Federico, please?
Say, I should stop sharing, right?
Up to you, but yes, maybe we should see Federico full screen.
There you go. Yes.
I love.
Thank you.
Hi. It's okay. Are you hearing me?
Yes. Very well.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Marcelo and the Brazil Lab, for this super opportunity to meet even at a distance. I feel honored to be here talking with Marta for the first time, and Marcelo, whose work I admire and find of unparalleled importance. I will be brief in my comments to leave more time for the debate and our audience questions. These are comments to get started the conversation more than specific questions that deserve answers. I will start by clarifying the point of view from which I talk. As mentioned by Marcelo in his presentation, I am an anthropologist, and as such, I close follow people who live inequality in their daily life. My assessment of the effects of public policies tends to consider at the core the point of view of those who are the beneficiaries, people and families. Based on research, my research group has been developing mainly in the favelas or slums and urban peripheries, Brazilian urban peripheries, mainly in Rio de Janeiro. On the other hand, my interest in economic emergencies, which predates the COVID-19 pandemic, makes inevitable for me to think about the issue of inequality and democracy in the tragic Brazilian present, following three threads. First, that of a better qualification of this present and of the process that brought us here, and of the ways of perceiving public policies in the current emergency by the so-called target populations. Second, a more detailed problematization of the relations between events, a new policy, an emergency situation, and the flow of the ordinary life of people and families reached or abandoned by public policies. And third, the place of austerity policies in crisis contexts, and more specifically in the context of the current crisis that seems to motivate a consensus contrary to the one that prevailed after the 2008 crisis, for example, which were very much guided by fiscal austerity. In the Brazilian case, perhaps we should not speak of consensus, given the ambiguities, at least, of the measures dictated by the executive and legislative during this last year, and even the last days about the new emergency aid or auxilio emergencial, the continuation of the constitutional public spending limits, and so on. It seems to me that the picture, the great picture drawn by Marta is incredibly significant and detailed. She objectifies processes that have agitated public debate, not only in Brazil, in the last 2 decades. As anthropologist James Ferguson would say in the book he published in 2015 about post-apartheid South Africa, with the suggestive title of "Give a Man a Fish," in an allusion to that famous question of whether one should give the fish or teach how to fish. As Ferguson says, the analysis of cash transfer policies forces social scientists to shed new light on a host of analytical issues ranging from labor and livelihoods to markets and money to dependence and personhood, in what for some time, perhaps no longer today, was thought to be a new and unprecedented welfare state in countries like Brazil or South Africa, a new welfare state based largely on direct cash transfers. In the Brazilian case, designed by Marta, clearly, but not only, the Bolsa Familia. Marta productively relates the implementation of income transfer or social protection programs and employment insurance, pensions, welfare benefits, Bolsa Familia, to the more general issue of to tax systems. Looking at one or the other, at transfer policies and social security, or the tax structure of the country, the picture are different. On one plane, we have a positive story of poverty reduction. On the other plane, we have a negative story of income concentration. These are the two stories on the first slide, I think the first or the second slide, showed by Marta. Poverty reduction or income concentration. Marta's answer seems perfect to me. Both stories are true. But how to articulate them? Or rather, how these two stories are articulated from the point of view of the poor, or of the poor people, to use the expression that Marta herself uses. I think that this is the real challenge that today's talk poses to us, or one of them at least. I obviously don't have the answers, but I would like to suggest 2 lines of inquiry to stimulate our conversation. The first is that the set of policies outlined by Marta invites us to establish other distinctions beyond those clearly established in the talk between, for example, the legal status of each policy or the rules of chains, whether they are legal or constitutional devices, for example. From my perspective, following the lives of some people who are beneficiaries of these programs, other questions appears also. I mention only 2 as examples. One, who are the beneficiaries? Men, women, unemployed, older, retired people. Of course, these questions are very much discussed among specialists, as Marcelo and Marta herself, of course. But then, one example, who are the beneficiaries? Men, women, unemployed, older retired people, others. Second, how are these policies articulated in the flow of people's lives? And at this point, how is the almost chemical transformation produced, I would say, between the money that is received by individual people or individuals who have CPF or CPF, social, something like the social security number, and the collectives to which they belong, especially their families and family networks, their houses and networks or configuration of houses. A second line of inquiry arises from the observation of a dimension of the economic dynamic of poverty that does not appear in Marta's talk, and that seems to me is crucial to the understanding of the effects of these policies on people's daily life. I am referring to credit policies and the dynamics of credit, debts, and indebtedness, which, as we know, had enormous expansion in the democratic period, and especially since Lula government, with the extension of banking services and of instruments of such as the crédito consignado, consignated credit, or something like this, for example. These two lines, the one that looks at the beneficiaries of the policies and overall the dynamics of their collective and not individual lives, and the one that looks at the dynamic of credit and indebtedness, are articulated, of course. This is what we see, for example, and this is just another example to go very fast. This is what we see when incomes obtained in the transfer programs are directed to the payment of debts, for example. I am not referring here to what some call the collateralization of social policies, for example, which has an effect on income concentration, but to the economic dynamics of families, to the money flows that allow individuals and families to plan for the future, or more specifically in times of emergency, like the ones we are living through today, to protect themselves against crisis by paying debts or advancing expenses. This is what shows the empirical observation of these dynamics following the economic lives of poor families in the contemporary context of the pandemic, for example. The first round of emergency aid, or auxilio emergencial, and people expectations about the second round, for example. This is a more general articulation that requires fine and nuanced views about the origin of the various monies that make up the economy of family and households of the poor, and the different destinations of these monies: payment of debts, realization of projects, imaginations, anticipation of expenses. Of course, emergency aid has a different status than the transfer or social protection policies analyzed by Marta. Even more, we know that historically, crises and emergencies tend to be super income concentrating, not income distributing or inequality diminishing. On the contrary, crises and emergencies accentuate inequalities, as we see dramatically in contemporary Brazil. Even more, so when the management of the emergency is tied with austerity policies, or when, as in Brazil today, it seems that we cannot leave austerity or fiscal balance as the normative horizon or public policies. Public policy. Thinking about the current emergency obviously requires returning to one of the subjects of Marta's talk, democracy, both as a political regime clearly at risk today in Brazil, and from a social and economic point of view, now in retreat due to the increase of inequalities generated by the management of the crisis, and not only if we see the long vision that Marta offered us today. But this point requires in turn a warning that serves to finalize my speech, my talk. The risk of establishing, as many commentators or public opinion specialists do, a link between the implementation of a social policies and the popularity of a politician or a government. We saw this when some denounced Lula's popularity due to the Bolsa Familia, for example. We see it now again when the popularity of Bolsonaro is explained by the Auxilio Emergencial or the emergency aid, or by the first round of it. Everything indicates that these causal relations go through a myriad of mediations, which leads us to ask about the meaning of democracy itself for those who are the subject, who are the object of the retrenchment of public policies we are discussing here today. That is, thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Federico. It was very, very instructive. I was paying lots of attention on that, and I learned a lot about what you said. And I think this seminar is a perfect match because we have, Marta speaking of, the broad political science point of view, and then we have an anthropologist posing very important questions behind a discussion that's actually dominated by economists that don't usually take those things very well into account. So I'm very happy with your comments. Thank you so much. And I would like to leave Marta some space so she can, answer your comments.
Yeah, I also thank Federico for his comments. They are very instructive. I have to confess some of your statements are new for me, so it's not easy for me to react in a fast way. I would react by saying that I agree with you that the study of credit policies is very, very important. Credit policies increased a lot in Brazil, particularly under Lula's government. But I have to confess that I didn't find many empirical studies on their effects on how they operate. And there is a discussion on the combination of the enlargement of credit policies and high interest rates. As you mentioned, it might end up increasing indebtedness instead of diminishing poverty. So I agree with you that this is a crucial policy. I'm 100% with you on this regard. But I have to confess, I haven't seen many empirical studies on that, but I suspect this is a possible outcome. It's on the relationship between crisis and inequality. I agree with you that crises entail poverty increase, in the sense that the poor tend to be the most affected by economic crisis. But I would add social policies as a crucial dimension. I mean, countries do not have the same policy answers to an economic crisis as we are seeing now regarding the COVID-19, the different policies solutions. So I, as a political science, I would reply that the policy orientations of governments do play a crucial role in the extent that economic crises produce inequalities and hit the poor. It's true that economic crises also shrink state revenues. So although the goal, let's say, fiscal, the equilibrium of the fiscal budget should not be the only goal to be taken into account, in the sense that people's well-being should be sacrificed on behalf of fiscal equilibrium. It's also true that policy solutions that do not take into account the long-term balance of the fiscal budget tend to not be sustainable. So we should have in our normative horizon both goals as serious dimension to be taken in account. But let me say a few words about the relationship between cash transfer policies and popularity. I agree with you. This is a very, very crucial issue. Many studies around the world demonstrate that cash transfer programs increase the popularity of politicians. So they have the strong incentives to launch or to enlarge cash transfer programs when their popularity are threatened, as we can see in the Brazilian case. We have many evidences as well that voters are short-minded in their retrospective voting, in the sense that it's true, there is a lot of evidence that if a politician launches a cash transfer program in the last year, in the electoral year, it tends to collect benefits. All that is true, but I would say that the cash transfer programs motivated by just collecting votes tend to be very different from cash transfer programs that were designed to combat, to fight poverty. And so as scholars, we should cite those that are designing policies aiming at both so policy seeking and vote seeking policies, those that combine, because of course we cannot expect from politicians to pursue politically suicide strategies, but we should think at policies that of course can reward voting, but are policies aiming at fighting poverty. They tend to be very different policy designs. But I will stop just to react very briefly, and surely not being just with Federico's comments, and go to the debate.
Well, thank you so much, Marta. I was like, we have a chat and YouTube chat, and we were collecting questions. So I received 3 questions, and I thought about, making the 3 questions at once, so you can decide in the bundle which ones or how you're gonna answer all of them. And the first question comes from Marcos Heckscher. Marcos Heckscher is a researcher from IPEA, and he is actually one of the most important researchers in inequality that IPEA has. And his question is to Professor Marta is, I'm going to read. A large part of Bolsonaro's voters declared that the 1964 dictatorship had a positive balance. Could this degree of support for the dictatorship, at least at that moment, have anything to do with the various inequalities experienced under democracy? And then we also have a question from Professor Carlos Fausto.
Would you please repeat, Marcelo?
Absolutely, yes.
I was thinking about my answer and missed part of the question.
Sure, absolutely, no problem. I'm going to read everything again so I don't miss anything. A large part of Bolsonaro's voters declared that the 1964 dictatorship had a positive balance. And that comes from the Datafolha survey from 2018. Could this degree of support for the dictatorship, at least at that moment, have anything to do with the trends of the various inequalities experienced under democracy?
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And we also have a question for a very dear colleague of the Brazil lab. That's one of our partners. It's Professor Carlos Fausto from Museu Nacional in Rio. And his question is, again, I'm reading, how does this radical process of change in terms of the distribution of income maps on the results of the 2018 elections, which means the election of Bolsonaro? Can I move to the third one?
Is it different because these two are on the same direction? So
yeah,
I prefer to respond each idea.
I think if you allow me, the third one is also related to that. Mm-hmm. So maybe you would use your time, trying to answer the 3 at the same time. So I'm going to read the third one. Regarding political coalitions, what were their role in the retrenchment of social policies in Brazil? Instead of redemocratization, the causes of such retrenchment shouldn't be political parties and the coalitions that were arranged in the executive and the legislative since 2015. And that's a question from Gabriel Skeff. I think the 3 are related, so
yeah,
please.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. These are very, very important questions. And the 3 of them may be informed by an interpretation I tend to share, but I have no evidence to give support to it. The story is the income distribution in Brazil went so far that there has been a reaction from the, let's say, privileged, from the rich, or from the elite that supported Bolsonaro. Let me first say that if Marcelo's interpretation is right, in the sense that there has been income concentration in Brazil during the Workers' Party government, there would be no reason for the elite to react. So the reason would not be if the elite was not touched in their, let's say, income concentration was not affected. Why would the elite react supporting Bolsonaro? this is the first objection to my suspicion, to the interpretation we share. Second, it's very hard to connect in the empirical terms the support to Bolsonaro to the changes Brazil underwent, to the inclusion process Brazil underwent, because we should find a way to demonstrate that those that support Bolsonaro declare they are against the profile of the income distribution we had in 2014. This is not easy to demonstrate, although I suspect that, let's say, a broader change in the way Brazilian society operate must be behind the conservative reaction and the support for Bolsonaro. It's true that Bolsonaro's agenda is an agenda that gives support to the idea that we should, it would be possible to let's say to travel to the past, to a safe and prosperous past we have had during the military regime, and the strategy to reach this desirable past would be to destroy the institutional arrangements that have been built as a result of the 1988 Constitution. So in Bolsonaro and Bolsonaristas' way of thinking, the past would emerge as a result of the destruction of the new. This is a conception actually shared by most conservatives around the world. But it's not clear for me, and I suspect that the economic dimension is not the only dimension behind this aspiration. I mean, they would like to go back to the traditional family, to the hierarchical society, they want to stop sociological change. Brazil indeed underwent that go far beyond the economic dimension. So I think I addressed Marco's question with this answer. Now I'm going to Carlos' question. I do not believe that the 2018 election can be explained only by the radical changes, economic changes Brazil underwent, although I think this is one dimension of the problem. But we should not forget that the party system in Brazil was almost destroyed by the Lava Jato, and we have had corruption scandals. They were not invented. So the 2018 election have more dimensions at stake than the economic dimension. But of course, we were under a huge economic crisis, and it's clear that voters wanted to punish all politicians. And Bolsonaro also had a good strategy and a lot of luck I don't believe that if there weren't Lava Jato and if there weren't the economic crisis, the Bolsonaro agenda would have had the same success. So, and then I go to Gabriel's question, which is, I think, again, a very delicate one to handle. My understanding is that all political parties in Brazil converge toward claiming political credits from the votes of the poor. That's why all decisions that are visible, highly salient, are approved by unanimity in Congress. That's why BPC was not touched, the earmarking of the minimum wage pensions was not touched. That's why Auxílio Emergencial was approved by unanimity. That's why Rodrigo Maia didn't call for a vote in the second round of Auxílio Emergencial because Congress wouldn't approve a cut by half of the Auxílio Emergencial and so on. So all political parties in Brazil know, all politicians know that they need the poor to be re-elected. It's the same in Chile, it's the same in Colombia, and so on. So all converge toward claiming political credits from the vote of the poor, and that's why they all favor what Alicia Holland, a professor of Harvard for political science from Harvard, says, the easy redistribution. So easy redistribution is quite similar to the idea of inclusion. So you give small gifts to the poor, but we do not touch in Brazil hard redistribution, meaning that we change the tax system, we touch the communication between the private and the public dimension of the health and the education system, and so on. So on this regard, retrenchment, the limits, I would say, the limits of redistribution in Brazil on the visible political arena, where in policies in which there is electoral competition, are able to approve easy redistribution, small gifts to the poor, but not hard redistribution, meaning that policies would touch the privilege of the elites, of the corporations, of those that have political power to push, to pressure the politicians in the parliamentary arena, which is made of hidden strategies that are not visible to the public. I'm not sure I answered, but I did my best.
Well, I think you did. I think you did very well. And
very difficult questions, actually.
I think they're addressed to you, not to me. And I was wondering if Federico would like to make any comments regarding that, please.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Very, very shortly, because as I said, I am not a political scientist. Then there is a field of discussion which I am not specialized in this. But anyway, I believe that this is a crucial point. All the questions, I absolutely agree with Marta and her answers. I think that I believe that both is a sociological mystery, of course. We have not answers. All causal explanation are necessarily poor. All kind of correlation, even if the correlation are in part always true, no? Between the economic crisis that worsened into from 2015, as Marta showed, the retraction of social policies. Of course, it should be some kind of links. No, the famous statement, its economy, etc., to explain political outcome of election anywhere. But we know that there are always many dimensions blend with the economic crisis in cultural terms and in political terms to explain how one candidate win the election. There are many, in the Brazilian case, in the last election, many, the dynamic of the electoral process is one of them, of course. The destiny of one of the candidates, who was the favorite in the electoral process, Lula, etc. There are many actors who add to who contribute to mold cultural interpretation of the events and to translate some kind of events in political actions, like, for example, the religious actors. Then it is very, I think that, of course, it's a very multi-causal phenomenon, which is not possible to grasp through electoral polls, or this statement about the coup d'etat or the military regime in 64. People are asking people who are now, there are also generational effects in the answers, and the answers are always very contextual. Then when you, as anthropologists, when we follow people in their daily life, we can, it's impossible not to grasp the volatility of political adhesions, or this is which is not volatility. Maybe is a concept of political commentators, but what I am trying to express is the cultural dimension of the vote. Then it's a very, very cultural charged act, which we tend to isolate from the flux of life in the polls and in the election itself. Then to make any kind of interpretation, unilateral interpretation, is a risky I think project or question. Then even if we need to take the economy into account, of course, it's not possible to neglect the importance of the economic crisis in all the political process. We were living from 2012, 13, 14, 15, etc. And the electoral outcome. But the electoral outcome is one event among many others, which form a very, very charged political process and very multi-dimensional political process. It's very difficult for me to answer yes, no, it's not. I think that that is why I agree with Marta's movement in her answer. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I think it's here is 5:44, so we're almost finishing. So I was wondering if Marta would like to make a last comment on anything.
I understand from the audience and by the participation of Marcelo and Federico, we are all concerned about the policies addressing income inequality in Brazil, particularly policies aiming at fighting poverty. And we are all very much involved in this debate. And this piece of work I have shown I show it in the final part of my my presentation is the result of research, ongoing research I'm sharing with Pedro Culano, Rogério Barbosa, Heloísa Kimiani, friends and colleagues of us. And we were struck by how fragile Bolsa Familia is. We didn't know that. And we noticed that cash transfer programs aiming addressing the needs of the very poor are designed in Brazil in such a way as to be fragile. So I think this is a debate we should raise, particularly because, of course, Auxílio Emergencial will be approved, but it's an emergency, it will end. But we are all involved in the debate of a basic income or a cash transfer program in Brazil. So I think that we should include into our debate the decision-making rules of these policies, so as to make them less fragile to the unilateral discretion of the executive government to decide over entitlement rules. Of course, we know that constitutionalization of policies are not as desirable because it entails too much rigidity. There are lots of problems involved in constitutionalization. But on the one side, we have policies that are constitutional, and on the other side, we have policies that are very fragile in terms of their decision-making rules. So I would like to invite my friends and colleagues to start discussing these policies from this perspective as well. I think this is a very important dimension for those, as Federico raised, for those that are not interested not in harvesting votes, but instead in reducing poverty. So that's my final words. But again, I liked a lot. Thanks a lot, Marcelo, Thomas, and Federico. It was excellent.
It was really, really a good seminar. Thank you so much. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Federico. You should invite us because we're going to show up if you invite us to your parties. So that you just made a mistake. But to conclude, I would like to thank you formally, Marta and Federico, for your participation today. I would like to thank the viewers as well, the viewers of home. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you participate in the future Brazil Lab events. And as a final note and a heads up, I would like to invite you to our next colloquium on March 25th, Insurgent Archivings, Decolonizing the War of the False Saints, Mucker, in a Southern Settler Frontier, 1868 to 1874, with the Professor Jean Biel presenting and Federico Neiburg moderating. And on April 1st, and this is not going to be at this time, it's going to be at 12:30 p.m., we'll have the 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:30 p.m. Brazil. And we will have the 2021 Stanley J. Stein lecture. The title is Atlantic Engagement, Entanglement. Oh my God. Let me start over. Atlantic entanglements in the era of abolition, Angola and Brazil, 1820s and 1860s, with Roquinaldo Ferreira and Isadora Moura Mota. And this event is going to be moderated by Professor Tomás Fujiwara from the Brazil Lab. Thank you so much. It was a great seminar, and I only have to say thanks and thanks and thanks.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye.